So, okay, cool. So hopefully this all works smoothly. Welcome to our, our, our pandemic journal club number two. So I thought since a lot of people are going to be writing a bit more, I wanted to do like a kind of intro guide into academic writing. So kind of just going over some basic tips as well as some things that I've learned along the way in my uh, grad career. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. And um, as people know, this is being recorded. And so let's move on. Let's go and do some writing. There's gonna be a lot of doggos, maybe just a few doggos. So full disclosure, I do not consider myself a very naturally gifted writer, but I somehow managed to write coherently. But a lot of times I feel kind of like this, where it's like, oh wow, what is this crap? And it's like, oh wait, I wrote this. But just as a overview, so I'm going to go over some tips like how to kind of approach writing a manuscript. So choosing a journal or having an idea of which journal you might want to target. Outline. Can't stress this more. Like, outlining is very important to being able to structure a well-written manuscript, and it also saves you a lot of time. And then I'm also going to go over some simple writing tips that can help improve your writing drastically with just a few easy steps. Also, I'll go over some useful guides and tools. So, for example, using different plugins to help with your reference managing. There's also some tricks and tips I found that is helpful if you're using Word as your editor. And as a bonus, I might go over some quick things on how to use things you can do in Word to make your dissertation writing a bit easier. And this is just like kind of overview. There's some really good guides out there. I sent out a zip file with some references. These are two papers that I reference a lot for kind of summarizing good techniques and things to do when you're writing a manuscript. First one's with Kevin Plaxco. So a lot of emphasis on this this guide is really making it as easy as possible for your readers to digest the information that you're trying to present. And then the Whiteside's paper, there's a huge emphasis on how to use outlines and like definitely starting earlier in the writing process, using outlines to help guide how you even choose which experiments to perform. So in terms of choosing a journal, so this is something that's maybe not the first thing you're going to do in the process, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. And so this, you're going to want to think about this earlier on as well as later on in your writing process. Things to consider is how new or novel is your work? Is this something that appeals to a general audience, or is it something that's more specifically suited for a particular audience? And people kind of tend to break up journals into different tiers, and people definitely feel free to interrupt if you have like suggestions or comments on any of the things. I'm trying to just kind of give a broad explanation of these, but usually you have your tier 1 journals. So these are like very cutting edge science, and it's a very usually general scientific audience. So the big examples are Nature, Science, and Cell. There's also some subjournals usually under Nature, such as like Nature Materials, Nature Biotech, Nature Methods. So these are very hard journals to get into. It's usually limited to very impactful and very, but not always, but very like new and innovative work. There's kind of these tier 2 journals, and some, depending on who you talk to, people might consider PNAS as like a tier 1 journal. It's kind of in between. And these kind of include these high impact general audience type journals, so PNAS, Nature Communications, Science Advances, as well as more field specific, but kind of at the top of those fields. So things like Advanced Materials, ACS Nano, Physics, Review Letters. So these are a little more field specific, but they're still kind of considered as still somewhat generally broad in those larger fields. And these are just, I tried to focus on examples that are papers that we commonly submit to in our lab. And then there's these kind of what I call like tier 3 journals, and these are much more specific subfields. So this includes things like lab on chip, analytical chemistry, ACS sensors, as well as some kind of less, I guess, impactful but still useful general research. So scientific reports +1 is another example. And I bring these up not to say like, oh, you should always try and strive to get into the highest tier journal, because I think that's a faulted argument. I think I bring it up more to when you're constructing your manuscript, you want to have an idea of who your audience is, and to do that, you need to know what journal you think is well suited for your work. And a lot of times, actually, if your work is very impactful to a very specific field, you might actually get more notice and more impact. So actually, I went through all of the Carlo Lab papers, and the top 10 most cited papers, 4 of them were on lab on chip, 2 of them were in PNAS, 2 were in analytical chemistry, 1 in bioanalytical chemistry, and 1 in PRL. And we do have some papers that are in some of these higher journals, so Nature Materials and Nature Methods, that aren't necessarily our most cited papers. So I think the key part here is understanding who your audience is, so that you can frame your story in terms of that. Does anyone have any comments or questions on this? Cool. So some other
Joe,
yeah.
I'm just curious. What is the most cited paper out of our lab?
It's Dino's PNAS, like the first inertial focusing paper. Dan,
I would also,
comment?
I have a comment, yeah. Just to say, like what you just talked about is sort of the utility of the paper itself towards communicating your work. There's another utility, which is creating your scientific portfolio. And this is something that you really shouldn't have to think about, but if you're considering a career in academia, it is important to have sort of a good breadth of different journals to go after. And so if you want to have an easy time getting jobs in academia, you kind of need to have at least one tier 1 publication, ideally multiple like tier 2, and then maybe sometime down there in tier 3. But even if you just have one tier 1 or a couple tier 2 applications, that's worth quite a bit. And I think that's not something you can really force. Either you have those cutting edge things in your work or not, but just kind of the reality of it. Yeah, I guess that's not really something anyone should have to think about, but in terms of doing good work, you know.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It helps bring, yeah. So I guess the caveat. So even though some of these papers that were in like what is usually considered lower tier journals got a lot of citations, it took a lot longer for them to get noticed and appreciated. And so, as you're mentioning, in terms of when people are looking for faculty positions or jobs, before it's clear what the impact of your work is, having it in like a higher tier journal, it's more immediately kind of recognized as, oh, this is something maybe more innovative, or yeah, just kind of it. Unfortunately, part of the academic game, and it's something to keep in mind. Cool. So moving on. So some other considerations too. So some of these journals, there's different article subtypes, and these different options will affect how many like figures, how many reference you can have, how many words you can have. So it's good to be generally aware of these before you start writing, and have some like idea of what journal you would want to target with your work. So common categories include, say, like a full research article. This could be 3,000 plus words in length, 5 to 10 figures. There's shorter communication / letters, so 2,000 to 3,000 words, usually less figures. And there's some even much shorter ones, like these short, rapid, brief communications. They're definitely much shorter in length, as well as reviews, which I think some people are going to be working on in the next coming weeks. And so, for example, there's some journals that only have certain types of these categories. So for example, advanced materials, they only have communications and reviews. They don't have full journal length. So if you have a ton of figures and a lot of work, if you write it all out, you might realize you have to condense this later on to actually fit this, the template for the journal. Whereas some other journals, for example, so advanced functional materials is a journal that has only full research articles and reviews. So they don't do communications here. And so this is just something to keep in mind in the back of your head so that you don't waste time thinking like, oh, I'm going to submit this here, and then realize while you're submitting that your paper is 2 times longer than the word limit. So things just to keep in mind. So moving on, and kind of this idea of how do you frame your manuscript. So you have this beginning understanding of where you might want to submit your work. You have an idea that's somewhat working. Thing you want to do is definitely write an outline. And I would argue you want to start this earlier than later. So I guess a rule of thumb would be when you have some confidence that the main concepts of your work is actually working. And it's also good to starting with figures, so sketching out figures to put as placeholders in. And the point of this really is it helps you identify what experiments to focus on. There's always like a ton of experiments that you can always do for a project, but some are going to be more important for whatever story you're trying to tell. And if you work on framing your story earlier on in the process, you can save a lot of time by not doing by focusing on experiments that are critical to conveying the story that you want to present. And so usually I'll start with just drafting some simple figures. And this is while I'm like still in the preliminary experimental stage. So I'll usually start with a rough draft. So here's an example that I have from like old journal club presentation I did on making figures. So this is just a sketch I did from our previous map gel paper. And so this is just like, okay, this was going to be a schematic figure. I wanted to show I just wanted to show, okay, here's our device, here's our polymers that we're putting in, here's some images that I might want to include into this. Just kind of have an idea of what I wanted to show people. And then while I was doing experiments, I could start collecting these things. I can start updating this and filling out schematics. And this is a very continuous process. So you're going to update these things as you go. And I think when you start earlier, it helps you develop a more convincing figures as well as more rounded figures. So this is even an earlier version, and then our final version looks something like this. This is after we have most of our experiments done. We know what works best. We've kind of troubleshooted some areas of the figures that were maybe confusing to people. Here's another example from a recent preprint that we posted on the dropical secretion work. And so sometimes I'll just include kind of just like filler schematics, or just kind of put some placeholder data that's not necessarily real, just to kind of get an idea of what I might want the reader to visualize. And then as I'm kind of working through experiments and designing them, I can start filling this out with more real data, or just completely revising it once if you realize something doesn't work properly, or you realize maybe this is not the most important data. And then once you have your experiments, you've done your analysis, you can kind of update this to a more finalized version. And I guess the thing I'm just kind of emphasizing is that kind of starting this early and then doing a step-by-step process, it kind of saves you a lot of time and headache later on. So aside from figures, there's a kind of general outline format that I find is really helpful. before you're actually writing the manuscript. So, and I included a template in the email, but so you just including simple things like preliminary title, author, some target journals. Abstract always do last. You're just gonna leave this blank. This is a succinct summary of your work. So unless your work is finished, there's no point in writing this. And then, so in your introduction, I tend to try to break it up like this. So first, you're gonna want to start with the large picture. So like, what is the problem that we're being addressed? You're gonna kind of focus in on, so what is the objectives? So what it clearly defining, like what is needed? Where is there a gap? Discuss what the background is. So what have people done? What is the limitations? And then summarize, so what are we going to do to solve this problem or fill this gap or fill this understanding? And also including some metrics of performance of how well did we achieve this? Just a kind of quick summary. Next would be results section. So this, in the early stages, I would just break it up into important subsections. A lot of times this ties in with your figures that you want to present. I would include a rough draft or a sketch of your figures in this case. And then after that is your discussion. So this is, a lot of times you'll do this, you'll fill out these details later on, but this is a point where you can concisely reiterate your points. You can speculate any potential impact of your work, as well as look at really like a big picture, like if what could you really like impact others in the field. And the last is the method. So this is going to be at the very end of the paper usually, or sometimes even in the supplemental information. And this, you're going to be concisely stating any relevant details needed to reproduce the work. And this should be very kind of short and straight to the point. And I think, and I tried to kind of allude to this as I was explaining this, there's this idea of like an hourglass writing structure and this is used across a lot of different kind of writing fields. And it's the idea that you should start with a very large general concept. You want to kind of funnel that into a main point or thesis. So this occurs during your introduction. You're going to give very specific details and evidence. So this is shown in your methods and results section. And the methods, it's so specific, sometimes this is just thrown at the end of the paper. And then you're going to want to restate your findings and then kind of expand out into a bigger picture. So this is something to keep in mind as you're kind of looking at the flow of your manuscript, or as well as your outline. This is usually a good way to kind of convey an argument or convey a story. And so some general writing tips I wanted to kind of go over. So tips with looking at paragraphs, when to use certain tenses, passive versus active voice, as well as writing with Dino, which should not be confused with the popular kids novel, Learning to Potty with Dino. Good thing Dino's not here right now, so this is great. This is I don't know if you've seen this. This is in their downstairs bathroom.
Which bathroom?
The downstairs one.
With Dino's face?
No, I did some Photoshop yesterday. I was feeling inspired. We can make a new one. It could be like writing with Dino, and then we can. Cool. Yeah. So kind of going up over, so paragraphs. So this is something that's emphasized a lot in Kevin Plasko's kind of outline guide to writing. You really want to make sure that you're only discussing a single idea, and it should have like a unifying theme. So a lot of times after writing a lot, I'll go back through and I'll double check, do my paragraphs, do they have only a single like concrete idea that I'm trying to explain? And if not, break it up. And a good kind of tip and test for this is you really, if you look at the first sentence, you really want to be able to explain what the main point of the paragraph's going to make, and how that's going to be supported with your following sentences. And so this is all just backing up what the point you make in your first sentence. And I think this is really important, because when you're really reading papers, you're skimming through, and so and this idea that you want to make it as easy as possible for your readers to understand the information. If each paragraph like very succinctly explains like what's going to be argued and concluded in that paragraph, you don't actually have to read the rest of the information to get an idea of what story is being told. And in Plaxico's, where he actually emphasizes this so much that he mentions how he tests his students by he'll go through and he'll just read the first sentence of each paragraph in a paper and see if that's enough to communicate the entire story by itself. So I wanted to include some examples. I'm gonna do a little quiz on people to see if people can figure it out. So this is an example from some papers. I'm gonna have you guys guess which ones they are. So continuous manipulation and separation of microparticles, both biological and synthetic, is important for a wide range of applications in industry, biology, and medicine. So this is just the first sentence of each of the introduction section of a paper. Inertial lift forces on flowing particles have been described in centimeter scale systems, and they are different in origin than lift forces on body and viscid flows. In this work, we use inertial lifts in laminar microfluidic systems to focus randomly distributed particles continuously at high rates to a single streamline, and we exploit particle geometry dependence to develop simple prototype systems for high throughput separations. Okay, any guess on what paper this is? I'm gonna wait until someone figures it out, even if they just type it in to Google. Dan, you should know this.
Is it Vortex? No.
This is a good test for it. Well, I'll give you a hint. It's Dino. I'm guessing everyone here should have read this paper.
Wait, is this the initial inertial paper or Vortex?
Yeah, it's the initial.
Yeah.
PNAS paper. Cool. Okay, I have a bunch of examples, but I'll just maybe go through one more. This one should be easy. So materials that can seamlessly integrate with surrounding tissue at the microscale are easily delivered in situ, can be broadly useful in long-term regeneration of functional tissue, development of continuous implanted sensors, and sustained drug delivery. To date, methods used to produce monodispersed microgel building blocks for the formation of micropore scaffolds are fundamentally limited by their low throughput and poor scalability. Previous work has demonstrated the potential to scale microfluidics for droplet generation and particle fabrication. Herein, we describe an approach to fabricate highly uniform microgel building blocks in a continuous, scalable, high throughput manner, enabling the formation of highly modular microporous environments for cell and tissue growth.
This is the MAP one.
Which one?
2015. Accelerated wound healing.
No, incorrect.
No, that's Joe's AFM paper. Step emulsification, yeah. Or step.
Oh yeah, it's the high
natural.
throughput. Sorry, I went based on the first paragraph. I didn't read the rest.
Yeah, you didn't. That's a problem.
Shut up.
Maybe it's a problem with my writing too. Maybe I should have made it clear. But you can see that you can kind of, I have more examples. I'm gonna send these out so people wanna look through, but like, and it's, you can test, I just went through one of the papers I wrote. I went line by line and double checked this. And sometimes it's not clear. And I'll just revise the first sentence. And I think it does help. It's small details like this that can make a big difference. This is the paper. I'm gonna skip through these examples. Cool. So just like a quick review of how to use tenses in your writing. And if people have other opinions on this, like feel free to, we can discuss it. So present tense. So this is usually used for most findings and observations. And there's some people in the science community maybe feel a little different about this. But the idea is that with the present tense, you're indicating that it's something that should be reproducible. So observations will remain true even after an experiment is performed. So an example is, we observe an increase in mean accumulated fluorescent signal on the particles that trends as expected with increasing incubation time. So this is a general observation, and it is something that should be repeatable with this general type of an experiment. So in contrast to that, so past tense, so this is used mostly in the method section and sometimes in the results section. And really it's describing a process that's performed at a specific time. So this is different from a general observation. So you'll usually, if you do use this in the results section, it's when you're describing like a very specific experiment or a specific way that you did experiment at a specific time. So just one example, so we observed a 26% increase in total IgG production for the sorted subpopulation in comparison to the pre-sort control population. So this is more detailed. We have a very specific increase that we're reporting. This is not something that will necessarily be held exactly true each time you perform the experiment, right? Another example would be, so the sorted subpopulations were seeded into a 96 well plate and expanded out of the particles over the course of 10 days. Although it's a little more general description of process, it's still describing a very kind of specific way of doing the process that could be modified if you repeated this. So it's, I would argue that in this case, you would want to use past tense. And this is kind of tricky. I was going through my manuscripts, and it's not always obvious which tense you should try to use. I think as scientists, we tend to write everything in past tense, but really you're kind of shortening your work when you do this. If it's like an interesting observation that you make or a conclusion that you make from your experiments, saying it in a present tense is a lot more confident, and also it kind of better conveys the really the impact of your work too. Any comments on tenses?
So one big thing as maybe a question or a clarifying point is, like, maybe in this third bullet point in past tense, we observed a 26% increase. Like, you could generalize that to observe, like, an increase is observed, right? Like, that can be present tense, right? I think the past tense implies that, like, it's not going to be 26% every time. Exactly. But when I'm generalizing my finding that there is an increase in IgG production, then I can use present tense, right? I think that's kind of the point we're getting at here.
So that's a great point. So actually, I would maybe want to, if I was going to revise this, I might want to go back and say, and I think maybe I had a sentence before that had a general claim, but I could say in a general sense, we observe an increase in the IgG production in comparison to the control. And in one specific case, we observed this increase. And so that's and there's a lot of ways you can kind of do that with certain claims or observations in your work. So it's just something to kind of go back and keep in mind when you're writing. And it's something that's easy to kind of overlook. So another thing I wanted to briefly touch on was use of passive and active voice. So this has been discussed for like decades. I think I found some research articles in Science and Nature that were talking about this back in the 50s. But scientists and editors are increasingly encouraged in the use of active voice. So by active voice, this means that the subject performs the action, whereas a passive voice, the subject receives the action. And the main reasoning for this is that, like, science isn't just some isn't some mysterious bubble of things occurring in space. Like, someone's performing an action is one thing. There's human interaction there. But two, typically writing an active voice, it's usually more clear. The sentences are clear, and it's usually more concise as well. So here are just some examples. This is from Kevin Plaxco's paper writing guide. But so instead of saying sequences were sequences were searched, you could say we searched the sequence database using blank. or instead of the level of sequence identity between chimps and human genes is large, which illustrates the relatedness of these species. You could say that the high level of sequence identity between chimp and human genes illustrates the relatedness of these species. I think this is like a definitely a more subtle thing, and I don't think you notice unless you're reading a lot and paying attention. But it's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're writing. So maybe something that people are more like.
Hey Joe,
Yeah,
can I
yeah,
add
yeah.
something to the passive active voice?
Yeah, go for it.
And so yeah, so one thing I learned was that the active voice is really good at conveying confidence, but then if you want to convey that you're unsure of something or that you're just hypothesizing something in your paper, it's good to use passive voice. And so also just like a small tip, but definitely I've also learned from Joe and other people is just to generally use the active voice unless you're displaying that you're unsure of something.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, and that's really the asterisk for all of these things, is that there is a time and place to use these different kind of sentencing structures and grammar, and it's just good to be aware that you do convey different ideas depending on how it's just simply how you structure a sentence versus like an active versus passive voice, or when you talk about something in the past tense versus the present tense. Yeah, that's a great point. Great point.
I think something brief before we move on. Something I've experienced in my writing is the choice of what is the subject or like what goes first, right? So in these two examples, this is only like tangentially related to passive and active voice, but you could say something like the relatedness of chimp and human species is illustrated by the high level of sequence identity, right? I think that more depends on what the focus of your sentence is, right? And you can make that the subject and present that first. I think that, again, that's up to like personal choice, right? This is all just what we're most comfortable with, but
Yeah.
You can play around with the different phrases that comprise your sentence and see kind of what things sound like, or what information is extracted from each sentence based on the order in which they're presented.
Right. And I think it's something you just kind of have to experiment with too. Yeah, great point. So these are more lab specific tips. So been in the lab for maybe, what is it, almost 4 years now, 3.5 years. Here's some just like general tips I would give for how to write with Dino and make the process as smooth and easy for him as well as for you. I definitely emphasize this. Outlining is critical. And I think the main reasoning for this is that if you don't structure your ideas well and you just write everything out, when you send a draft to Dino, for example, and this applies for anything, if you send a draft to someone, if your structure sucks and you have everything written out, it's really hard to revise it to fix it, because you have to, instead of moving just bullet points around, you're moving whole blocks of text and have to completely structure how you're flowing your text between different paragraphs. Whereas if you spend the time to do multiple outlines and really make sure you have a good structure earlier on, this can save you a lot of the revision process. And this also, you'll get more feedback faster if you do this. Just like simple observations I made when people, if they didn't spend enough time doing outlining, usually your PI or Dino, for example, will take a lot longer to get back to you with revisions because they have to do a lot more to give you more advice, or they'll just give you kind of very vague blank advice, and then you'll have to just keep iterating it until you get closer to what they wanted. Pun sort of not intended, but yeah, if you get it right before you start writing all the details out, it'll save you a lot more time. And then kind of connected to this, like, you should really expect to do a lot of revisions with your work. I've heard of anywhere from 10 to 30 revisions before actually submitting. So it's not a quick process. It gets faster, but it's really you're crafting a kind of a piece of art, I don't know, piece of work in a way. And even though a lot of people, maybe they'll just kind of skim your paper, creating something that flows well and has a great story, it really can make a huge difference for how you're able to communicate your ideas. And I think especially in our lab, so figures are the blood of your paper. Like, we put a huge emphasis on how we visually convey information in our lab. And I think part of the reasoning for this is that, at least if I read a paper, I'll read the title first. Maybe of all the papers I look at, 90% of them, I'll just look at the title. Maybe 10% of them, I'll read some of the abstract. And then after that, or even before that, sometimes I'll skim the figures. And then maybe 1% after that, I'll read some of the results text or look in the methods section. And maybe like 0.1% of papers I actually look at, I'll read all the way through line by line. So this is definitely something that can catch people's eye, but also it's a really effective way of conveying information quickly and efficiently as possible. And then one tip I'd say, so in terms of writing, Dino is a very experienced and is a very good writer. But if he has one issue that he sometimes has, is he loves long sentences. And so I think these are fine in moderation. There's always going to be natural kind of cadence. It's good to kind of mimic writing with how you speak. There's a kind of cadence where you go from longer phrases to short, concise phrases. As kind of like a rule of thumb, to see if something's too long, I'd try reading the whole sentence out loud with, I should say breath, but with one breath. So here's an example from a recent SLAS paper on directed evolution from Dino. So this is in the abstract. So, okay, one breath. So although there has been success in introducing targeting proteins into cells to achieve a therapeutic effect, for example, chimeric antigen receptor CAR T cells, our ability to engineer cells is generally limited to introducing proteins, but not modulating large-scale traits or structures of cellular machines, which play critical roles in diseases. Okay, so not too bad, but say you find this like maybe a little too wieldy. Maybe it needs to be broken up a little bit to make it easier to understand. I know for me personally, I had to read it a few times just to kind of understand the various arguments that were trying to be made within this one statement. So one approach is just break it up, split it into two sentences. So here would be bringing up, so one sentence could be just talking about using targeting proteins in cells to achieve therapeutic success. The second point being made is that there's been limited action to actually introducing, doing large-scale, modulating large-scale traits in these structures or cellular machines. So you could break it up into something like this. So there has been some success in introducing targeting proteins into cells to achieve a therapeutic effect. For example, chimeric antigen receptor CAR T cells. However, modulation of large-scale traits or structures of cellular machines which play critical roles in disease is limited. So this is just one way you could kind of break this up. Option 2 would be to cut extra information out. I mean, so this is an abstract, for example, so maybe you don't need all of these information, maybe you do. So for example, here you could just, see these are parts that maybe these were actually more important, maybe not, but you can still convey the same idea without, for example, including the chimeric antigen receptor CAR T cells or the statement at the end. So this would be one way of kind of succincting your statement to something shorter and maybe more easy to kind of understand the main ideas. Cool. And of course, option 3 is just to leave it as it is. Sometimes it's fine. Sometimes in order to be kind of more accurate, we have to use maybe a little bit longer statements or structures. But I think in general, it's good to try and make things more concise and easier for the readers to follow or understand. Did anyone have any questions or comments?
Yeah, yeah, Joe, I have a comment. Yeah, so I think with Dino, he prefers like precision sometimes over clarity,
Mm-hmm.
and this kind of writing is actually really good for something like patent writing. But definitely, I agree, and perhaps some papers or review papers, it might not, be terribly useful. But yeah, just understand like having all these extra details do come into play in other places as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sometimes it does make sense a lot of times too within scientific writing, and there's just kind of a balance you have to play. Dino's not here
Right,
to
because I think a lot
defend
of
himself.
scientific writing also you want to focus on ways of being precise as well.
Yeah.
So it's just a balance there.
Right. Yeah, but I think too, like, yeah, if you're when you're breaking it up into multiple sentences too, that's the easiest way to still include the precision, but not have it be as like unwieldy in terms of digesting information. I think Mark froze up. Cool. So I just had some last kind of useful things if you're not using them already. So Mendeley has this. I think Zotero, some other referencing softwares has this where you can just have a Chrome or maybe a Firefox plugin. So if you're reading an article on the website, you can just go over here. You can add it to your library. So this is really easy for like when you're just reading a bunch of papers and you want to compile a list for including in references later on. And I think this is also important. So there's other things people use too, but so like for example, Mendeley and I think some of the other programs, they have built-in plugins in Word where you can actually import your libraries from their database and automatically create references. And the cool thing with a lot of these, and I think most of them do these now, is you can look up the specific styles for certain journals. So say, for example, you want to submit to Lab on Chip, you can actually download the formatting style for that journal so you don't have to edit it yourself. So other examples include EndNote, Zotero, and I don't have as much details on this, but you can definitely Google this and find more information. As a last bit, so I've been working on my dissertation lately, just some really easy kind of quick tips to make your life maybe less miserable when you're doing this. I also included a template, which should also hopefully save people some time. That's in the email. So really you can, at least for us in our department, you can copy and paste your own manuscripts and reuse a lot of your texts and figures when possible. And just you make sure you acknowledge and cite it properly in your dissertation. And please do not manually update figure numbers, equation numbers, references, table of contents. There's built-in ways of doing this. And it's for like maybe a single paper, you can get away with it and it's not too bad. But when you start having like 30 plus figures or 500 citations, it gets really a headache and you can spend a lot of time doing this. And I have a Word template that I sent out, I think, for this. And so part of this, so you don't have to, in order to save your time with these things, there's functions built into Word. And for people who use LaTeX, like you already, like you don't have to worry about any of this. It's already kind of built in, but some of us are still stuck in the Word workspace. So using headings, so maybe some people are already using these. So headings are really useful for breaking up your document, having different navigation so you can quickly go to different sections, but also you can use it to keep track of a table, automatically generated table of contents in your Word document. It can also be used, and I'll kind of go into detail here, but in combination with your figuring numbering schemes. So you can automatically generate figure numbers in Word. So you can create a caption, and then you can actually, so you just go to references, insert caption. You can even do formatting so that it does numbering based off your heading. So if you have it broken up into chapters, instead of having it just increasing like figure number 1 through 100, you can instead have like figure and then does like 4 for chapter 4, and then like it's the second figure of chapter 4. And so a lot of this can be automated. And then when you're actually referencing it in your text, because sometimes you're going to be moving your things around, you can go to the references, and if you go into, oops, I think the line got moved improperly, but sorry, that should be circling cross-reference. And you just, this will insert, say right here, it'll say like figure 4-1, but it'll refer specifically to that figure caption. So if you move things around so that these numbering update, it'll automatically update in your text. So you don't have to go back through and double check like 100 figures to make sure that all the numbering is correct on that. So this just saves you a lot of headache, especially when you're working with really long documents. And it's also, this would be really useful when you're working on reviews, which tend to be longer and have a lot more figures and citations and things. And on that note, I got more images of doggos typing on computers, which apparently there's a lot of. But does anyone have any questions or any comments or things they wanted to discuss? Or did it freeze up?
No, it's not frozen.
Oh, okay.
That was really
Thank you.
helpful,
Very
Joe.
useful. Yeah, very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, I included some templates and things too. I know for some people who've written a lot more, maybe this is not as, it's a little more things they already know, but I try to include as many, at least small details I thought might be useful for people. Cool. So I guess on that note, this is the end of our journal club. I'll send this, I can send this this PowerPoint out too, or put it on the drive.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you.
Cool. And maybe in future journal clubs, people, who is next week, by the way?
Me,
Kaylin, what are you gonna present on?
nothing that's gonna be recorded.
That's okay. Oh, I guess I can stop my recording now. Stop.
No.
Hopefully I hope it worked.